Hey, everybody. I'm trying something new this week that I'm really hoping to do a lot more of going forward. It's a video and audio conversation with a dear friend of mine, Analía Gómez Vidal. She's a career coach, a researcher, a facilitator, and she's the founder of AGV Services LLC. Annie specializes in mentoring international students on the challenges and opportunities of coming to live and work and learn in the US. We talk a lot about this interesting work in this episode. More importantly, Annie is someone who I think, thinks really broadly about what a good full life looks like. The hobbies and interests we bring in to round out that life, and specifically interests like poetry, for which we both share a passion. And we talk about that here too. And in all of this, Annie tends to think a lot, like I do, about the intersection of place and identity. And so I knew she would be perfect for this little audio-visual experiment. And I really hope you all enjoy it. Annie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. I feel like in sort of reconnecting recently, I feel like we've learned that about a lot of things that we have in common, that I think have developed a lot over the past several years, as I think both of us have undergone significant transitions in our lives, career, personal, etc. And I think one thing I really love about you is that it seems like you do a lot of intense thinking about how to be a wholesome human who is sort of trying to get the most out of life possible, which can be a daunting task, but I'm thankful to have someone like you to talk about with it. I just listed a whole bunch of really impressive things on your resume and accolades, a lot of which makes a lot of sense to me and are things that I recognize. Some of them I don't. How would you sort of describe your work generally in like just a few sentences to someone who just met you? Is that even possible based on all the stuff I just read?
It it is difficult, and I think that sometimes I find myself trying to, connect the dots often, especially because this is also something that I share as part of my work with anyone, whether it's like through workshops or with my clients, the importance of telling your story and you being the one in charge of your story, right? I think that the best way of connecting the dots for people that I have is that I am someone who's deeply passionate about connecting people, ideas, and spaces. And I have used the tools that feel the most natural to me as a way of doing that at each step of the way. So I started by being a very good student and finding my way through making a career out of studying and learning. And then from there, I started identifying gaps in my own experience and the institutions that I was interacting with and the stories that we were telling about the discipline and where we were and all that. And so I decided to kind of like take that leap to, address that by again connecting people, ideas, and spaces in ways that could serve the community as a whole. And so I think that seems to be the through line for me, that whether that is in academic spaces, in professional spaces, in creative spaces, I have a knack for identifying ways of creating through community and synergy.
I totally think you have that gift as well. I've sort of seen it unfold as you have started your business, which is something that sounds really scary to me. I have never done anything like that, and it sort of strikes me that it really resonates what you say about being in charge of your own story, because a lot of times in life, I think, especially when we're younger and just getting started, like you and I were maybe in grad school, that a lot of times your work is defined by the limits and restrictions that are put on it, that are imposed by other people, where you've got other people sort of, some people giving you sort of good open-ended advice, and then others maybe outright telling you or ordering you how to sort of pursue your career and how to be successful and live your life, and like, here are the 5 things you need to do. um how have you sort of navigated that from, you and I came up in grad school where there is this very sort of prescribed way of doing things of like, get published, get a tenure track position, not just get published, but get published in these specific places and stay in your lane and like do all the and learn the quantitative stuff and make sure your methods are. And I'm really curious about your transition from that period of time that we experienced together in grad school to going off in all these different and really interesting directions that I presume are sort of closer to that kind of authentic version of yourself. Like, how have you kind of made that transition so wonderfully?
So I would start by saying that it has been gradual. And I think for me, maybe a blessing and a curse was that I started grad school without fully investing in the idea of pursuing an academic career. I remember, like going to our building on campus at University of Maryland during the first week that we started our program and thinking to myself, I hope I like this.
I definitely had a similar thought.
And so I always thought of my PhD as a means to an end, and the end was not a specific career or role, but rather just knowing that the ceiling of opportunities that I had access to was much higher than what I was coming from back in Argentina. And so every single step that I have taken since has always been a little bit about the strategy of, okay, how do I get to the next step? And like, how do I connect the dots here? And how do I go from there? Right. And the other element of that, it's like, I always say the same thing, and I lived through it, that, as an international student, you play a different game. So you have to navigate things in a different way. And so I have always thought about everything that I did from the perspective of options. So to me, academia was one option, but I just wanted to open the board as much as I could. And I think for a lot of people, that didn't necessarily resonate with them. And so, there were a lot of either comments in passing or things that I would find out later on about the perception of my decision making. But I also found a lot of comfort in people who also empowered me or gave me some, like, the space to be like, okay, it's your life, you decide. And I would be like, yes, I am deciding. And so, like, that was helpful. I would say the other thing about it is, we both recognize the value of places and how they shape us. And I think for me, coming into the process as an international student in a completely new space, in a completely new country to settle in and all that stuff, I think that also opened up the space for me to get to know myself in a different way and tap into a lot of this creativity that, had I stayed in Argentina, I may have not come across, right? And so, like, giving myself permission to meet myself again was really helpful to think about what's possible.
That makes a ton of sense. It totally resonates with me. And in thinking about, you mentioned this journey as an international student, and your business, AGV Services LLC, is a lot geared towards, mentorship and helping current international students with think about a lot of these questions that you have just brought up that clearly were occurring to you at the time, in terms of, what does this mean? What can I do with this? what things are limiting me? What are some ways I can keep my options open? For anyone out there who's sort of wondering what that journey is like what are some specific questions or uncertainties or challenges maybe that international students or different types of international students, coming to the US to pursue their education in one way or another, like what are some of those challenges, and is it possible to turn those into opportunities or turn those into experiences that can help you down the road?
Yeah. So I would start kind of like high level, that the best way that I can describe this is, a few times I've used the metaphor of kind of like building a castle in the air, right? So like you continue building your career and thinking about, what the next step looks like, but you don't necessarily have a solid ground. And what like what is that solid ground concretely is the visa sponsorship. That is one of the biggest concerns, if not the biggest concern, that any international student has. And that concern gets heightened at different points in times and during different administrations. And so what that translates into is that whenever you're thinking about either doing your dissertation or doing your research that plays a role, because, for example, there are specific types of grants and fellowships that you might not be eligible for. So you don't have the same access to funding that others have when you are looking for grants for your research. When you are going into the job market, depending on the type of visa, you might have certain time that you can make the most of to continue working after graduation, which is called the OPT. So we will see how policy moves in that direction, whether it remains or not. But for the time being, you may have 1 to 3 years of working in the US after graduation based on the degree that you got. But not everybody knows about this or how to go about it. And so even in roles where you might be qualified and ready to step in, they might not hire you because, they don't sponsor and they don't necessarily have the education on the subject or specific unit that focuses on this. And so what that means is that when you are thinking about your career and what's possible for you, it is very often the case that you start from the constraints, just like I did now in that description, right? And so that then leads a lot of us to kind of like be in this headspace of what is not possible. And that then translates into like something that I make a lot of emphasis in when I talk either in panels or presentations or one-on-one with clients, which is, the paradox of, who we are and what we do as international students and international professionals. On one hand, our experiences and our resilience and creativity and adaptability and all these different things that have gotten us here are like best things. And at the same time, the fact that we are international students and workers and we need sponsorship also makes it a lot harder for people to really embrace us and kind of like open spaces for us. So then that takes a toll in how we see ourselves, in our sense of self. And so I always share this one story. One of, my many outlets has been improv, and I do a lot of bringing applied improv. So meaning I bring principles of improv into my practice as a coach and as a consultant. And I had a mentor who recently passed away. His name is E.C. Gessel. And we were in a conversation about how I was navigating this experience of going through the job searching process as an international student, how I also wanted to support others going through that. And at one point, he looked at me and he said, "Well, you're an improviser, so you know how to play with the environment." And initially, I kind of like, it took me a second and I was almost like, how dare you? But then as I processed what he had said, that was one of the most valuable lessons I have had. And it has really changed entirely how I think about my life, but also my own practice and when I support others in that process, which is, okay, so this is what we're working with. This is the current state of affairs. That does not take away from who we are, from the value that we have, from the goals that we have. And they might change, they might adjust, the timeline might not be the same. How we get to that might need a lot more creativity and might not be as linear as we would hope for, but we will still get there. And that's the key part of it. And that's a lot of the work that I do now. But I would say that, for anyone trying to understand what the experience of an international student or, an immigrant in the country, whatever country that is, it could be the US or anywhere else, I think it is important to recognize that there is this sense of possibility that feels constrained from the get-go.
Mm. That's so interesting. It sort of makes me wonder, from my perspective as an instructor, a professor, a mentor of students, Boise State is not a huge hub of international students in the same way that a lot of, East Coast, elite East Coast and West Coast schools are. But, one thing I am always wanting to get better at is to meet students where they are and mentor them where they are and where they're coming from. And so I guess I'm wondering, I've had my own thoughts about how to best do that with international students, which who I've been lucky enough to mentor at a number of different times. I'm wondering if you know of anything that is something that faculty or school administrators or people in the lives of international students who are trying to mentor them and help them navigate some of these challenges, either what's something they get wrong or maybe what's something where there is something they can do to help improve their mentorship, whether that's something to listen for, a proactive step you can take, or is it something simpler?
Yeah. So I would say the advice that comes to my mind is not just for international students, but for all students, particularly when thinking about their career development. And I think it's especially important with international students. And that is to really start moving away from the framework of academic performance and really taking that step back to really understand the context and the humanity of the person that they have in front of them. I mean, I remember, hearing a praise about my performance or how I was doing and all of this stuff. And then in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, but I am dealing with a lot to even get here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether that was, like I was at a very competitive or outperforming others, while at the same time just like feeling like I was just like going in an uphill battle because I had to apply for a lot more of a smaller grants to put together enough funding for then having a chance at doing the surveys that I did online surveys so that it was cheaper for me to do it, or starting very early on with career exploration, because I realized that I was in the fourth year when I realized that in our department, we didn't have any other international student who had graduated as an international student and secured a job in the US. And like in the last 10 years at that point or something along those lines. Everybody else had gone abroad after or gotten married, which was not an avenue that I was interested in at that point.
Right.
And so then I I recognized very early on that I needed to start gathering all the information and connecting with people and expanding network and being a very self-managed when it came to my career development, because there was not a lot of evidence around that others had done it the same way. And so I think that from a faculty perspective, really understanding that these are some of the obstacles that are coming up for a lot of students. I think that also, we are all trying to figure out what life looks like, especially now as like AI moves forward and we are not entirely sure of how that's like redefining the labor market as a whole and what that means for entry level jobs. And so there is so much going on that it can be really difficult to fully grasp that what you're seeing on the page as the performance of one student in this one class might not tell you everything that they're going through right now.
That makes a ton of sense to me as I think about, a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the ways I think about the world, especially this thing I think we have in common that we've talked about before, which is thinking about our lives and our story and our careers through this lens of place and environment, where especially professors, thinking about students, it can be tempting, especially when there is a ton of grading to do, to like think about your classes and your students and the students you're mentoring, even if you really care about them, as like this undifferentiated blob of people. Oh, they're all students, and yeah, I was a student once, and so their concerns were probably my concerns. But all of these people are living and working and studying in their own context, in their own unique story. And particularly for international students, I think place is a huge, I mean, I would think place is a huge
Mm-hmm.
component of that. This is a common thread in my work and in the more personal space of the newsletter of place. And like, if I have a kind of mission statement or like thesis statement for myself and my work, it's that place and location are not just really important, but really, really undervalued and underappreciated in our civic life, our professional lives, our personal lives. And so I wonder, you mentioned a couple of things about your experience and sort of, coming to UMD and navigating some of that. I wonder, as a way for folks to get to know you, if you'd mind kind of giving me your, kind of a Cliff's Notes version of sort of your story from the perspective of place, especially since, as someone who's been lucky enough to know you for a while,
Mm-hmm.
I know you've had some interesting and sort of complicated stops along the way.
Yeah. So in terms of place, I'd say that it is my story starts with my family story. All my grandparents came to Argentina from Galicia, from the rural area of Spain. And, they all had like very different stories, but also very similar. They were all trying to make a living, kind of like the American Dream
Sure.
Argentine edition. Um, and as they started their lives in Argentina, both of my parents are the first ones in their families to be born and raised there. Then we were born, and we were born in that same neighborhood where they both, because actually, like, my parents were neighbors. So we were all in the same neighborhood, which was an immigrant neighborhood. And so I was very much raised surrounded by immigrants, and always hearing the people speaking broken Spanish or Gallego or Italian or Portuguese, and then growing up, I also was fortunate enough to learn languages throughout my life, and so I learned many languages as a teenager because that
Yeah.
was a hobby. Um, and so between those stories around, like the being raised in the immigrant mindset. I was raised in a household where I was told that the only way was education. And so we didn't really go on vacations much. And if I wanted to travel and practice my languages, then I guess I would have to use my education. And that's what I did. So the very first time that I traveled by myself. When I was 17, I came to the US for a month in an exchange program because I sold my parents on the idea that I needed to have an immersive experience if I wanted to make sure that I was good at speaking English.
Of course.
So that was the first time that I traveled abroad. And I remember, speaking of writing and journaling, I remember journaling in English when I came back. And I wrote down that I didn't know how, but I knew that this was the beginning of what my life would look like.
I mean, you couldn't write that in a book. It's really beautiful. I
Yeah.
mean,
So
what made you feel that way about this experience, about this trip that you took?
I think that it was a combination of things, but the main one I would say is that it was the very first time that I had the space and the permission to both get to know myself in a context where I was getting to know everybody else.
Mm.
So in some ways for me, having that first exposure to what the world looks like outside of my, familiar environment was an exposure to possibilities.
That's so interesting. Like when a lot of us, you mentioned education as this driving factor, and certainly, like as someone who's had way too much education, I can relate to that. Um, and I think a lot of people think about education as, whether it's college or whatever else, you're going and you are a sponge. Like you're taking in all of these ideas and experiences and people, right? And you're sort of collecting things and learning about things that are on the outside that you didn't know before. But it sounds like there's also this element which I have experienced, but I think is really underappreciated about education, which is you're not just taking things in, you are learning things about yourself that you can then offer and put out into the world, right? It's not just this taking, it's also this giving that can be the
Mm-hmm.
end result of it. And I mean, it sure sounds to me like, based on what you have done with your career, especially now, that you have found a really unique way to flip that sponge metaphor and put your experiences out there in a kind of new form of education.
Yeah, exactly. And then what was interesting too is, like that was the first time, but not the only one. Both because I ended up moving to the US in 2014 and having my whole journey since. But I also I was fortunate enough to be an exchange student in Paris for a while. And that was also a very interesting experience where you see all these different variations of what international education might be. And they all have, their own nuances and their own, like pros and cons. But to your point, and kind of like thinking about the importance of place and the importance of the people that make the place, each of those experiences left something different for me that became a way of self-exploration.
This is what I think is part of the beauty of place, which is just by being there, you are learning something. It doesn't have to happen in a classroom. It doesn't have to happen in any specific location. It's this life experience that I think really matters. And one other thing I wanted to talk to you about, just because I think another kind of thread of similarity that we have is that, especially over the last few years, I feel like we have both done a lot of thinking and reflecting about the kind of work we want to do and what we want our work to look like, how our work can be useful to other people, how we can get it in front of people so it can be useful and not just fulfilling to us, although I think we both want it to be fulfilling to us as well. Um, and so I guess I'm wondering, especially, this term of work-life balance has been, you know, used and overused and overcomplicated. Finding this right balance between sort of simple joys that are totally separate from work and integrating these joys into your work life. This is
Mhm.
something I struggle with all the time. Um, I wonder if there's anything, if something that you've done that's really integrated into your work as a way of finding
Mhm.
joy in your work, and then maybe something that you've done or do regularly that is completely separate from your work, but that also brings you joy in a totally separate capacity.
I tend to explore different avenues and then eventually and bring them back. So, an example of that I mentioned is improv.
Mhm.
So, I started taking improv classes when we were in grad school because speaking of work life balance, I had moved to the area for grad school and I was caught in this loop where I would work a lot on campus and then I would go out and we would all hang out and be in the bar and continue talking about grad school. So, like, there was no balance.
Yes, boy, oh boy. This is frankly, this is what I find even today. Like when I go, I'm really close friends with my fellow like faculty members at Boise
Hmm.
State, and we'll go out to happy hour and we'll just be like talking about our students and like our
It's
work and how this
inevitable.
journal rejected me, right? And like on the one hand, it's really cathartic, and I think it's important to have that commiseration. But also sometimes it's like, guys, can we talk about anything else? And I definitely remember exactly that, having that experience with you and the other folks we were with in grad school.
Yeah, and so, after a while, it was like a year and a half in, I had a couple different experiences that were like, warning signs. So it's like, okay, I need a little bit of balance. So I ended up taking a hobby and I started doing improv, which is, by the way, something that I always suggest to anyone who is in grad school, but especially international students in grad school. Find a hobby, something that feels like, even if it is on campus, like it can be inexpensive. You like running, go to a running club, whatever it is that just like helps you balance your sense of self. Um, so I started doing improv. And what happened was, like initially it's like, how does this connect to grad school? How does this connect to research? And yet I always found ways. So as I mentioned, like then I started learning about applied improv and the way of bringing the improv principles into my coaching, but also, thinking about the different skills. It comes in very handy for, like public speaking and presentations, even though I still get more nervous presenting research than presenting anything else. Um, so yeah, so I have a tendency to kind of like bring things back in a similar way. More recently, I started writing poetry a lot more and connecting again with poetry in a way that I had not in a really long time. And so now, for example, my own newsletter, I also I include a section that is called a sip of joy. And so every week I include something that brings me joy as a way of also not just like preaching it, but also facilitating it.
Yeah.
And that has included poetry in the past, or podcasts or newsletters, including yours. So yeah, so those are ways in which I look to integrate things more intentionally. And again, I fully recognize that not every space that we are a part in feels safe to be our full selves, but
Mhm.
to the extent that we can, I think it is important for us to continue fostering those environments where we get to welcome everything that we are, both because it's important for our well-being, but it also makes it all the more valuable and unique to everybody around us because everybody benefits from that authenticity.
I completely agree. anyone listening to this will know that I'm so happy you brought up poetry, and that poetry is something that we share, because it's something that, so far as I know, neither of us are like learned experts in per se. But poetry for me, that was my thing during grad
Mhm.
school that I stumbled upon. I had read poetry before that I liked, and I had, could remember a couple poems from high school that really resonated with me, but I never had made it a point to like sit down and read a book of poetry. That had never occurred to me. And about, I don't know, 2 years, 2.5 years into grad school, during this period of time, which anyone who's sort of been in a PhD program will know, like this is a very topsy-turvy time. You've got like, your comprehensive exams, you've got finishing up your classes, transitioning into the dissertation, and the pressure of coming up with an idea. And what I found was like I need some quiet moments here and there, and these can happen in the mornings where I can, before I start immediately opening my email and going to work, I am going to force myself to sit down for 30 or 45 minutes and read a dozen poems, and mark the ones that I like, and have special marks for the ones that I really like. And I have this whole system of colors.
Which,
And
by the way, when you shared that on the newsletter, I was so blown away by that system. I just want you to know.
I appreciate that. I mean, it makes like no sense in a way, but it makes sense to me, and it gives me a lot of satisfaction to like look at my shelf right here and see all my little flags. I mean, it's a nice reminder of like, this is something that I have done, and sometimes like the different flags I use change over time, and the use of certain flags is like, oh, I know that I marked this when I was living in this house because that's when I had. And these are fun ways of tying the poetry I read, which, like, by the way, like I started really seriously reading poetry, and it would have been like 2016, I think, which is like almost amazingly 10 years ago at this point. And so I'll go back and I'll look at poems that I've marked, and no earthly memory of reading this poem. And I read, I'm like, oh, this is a pretty good poem that I marked. He had good taste back then. But it will take me back to a particular, a chair I was sitting in when I read it, and like things that are no longer in my life, or like a bedroom I had that was
Hmm.
not the same. Um, but anyway, this was my hobby that I found, and I'm so happy to I've been so happy to discover that it's something that you really care about as well. Um, like what does that do for you? What does poetry do for you, and what do you think it could do for others who maybe feel, as I fear many people feel about poetry, which is intimidated? Like what does that mean for you?
So I would say, as you were describing this last part about like places and poetry, you sparked a memory for me that one one time where I felt like I kind of like intuitively fell into mindfulness during grad school was I read Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke, and I remember visually going to Lake Artemisia in College Park and sitting in the gazebo reading that book.
I wish I had known you were doing this at the time. We could have bonded even more than we already did. I was like reading Rilke at the time and being blown away by these insights that he makes about spirituality and God and all
Hmm.
these things. If I had known you were just across the street at Lake
Yes.
Artemisia, I would have come talk to you.
Um, and yeah, and like I'm gonna botch the quote, but like the quote about like letting the questions
Yes.
unfold.
Mhm.
Always, it's a book that I come back to repeatedly because of that. But since then, a lot has gone by. And then I more recently reconnected with poetry, first as a reader, because I think there is something like deeply spiritual about poetry. And not surprisingly, the way that I connected again with poetry was as I was going through my coaching training and I was finding the practices for more mindfulness and intentionality in how I show up for myself, for my clients through the whole process, connecting with my intuition more, that I would have like poetry books. Particularly I have one by Rumi that I had by my desk. And so before a coaching session, I would like review and read a couple poems and kind of like take it in and go. And then I actually I have one of these poems that I have in front of me on my desk at all times, that I actually like in the moments where like the session, like allows for it or, merits it, I would even like read it out loud for the person that we are in a session with. And it's this poem. Are you familiar with The Guest House?
I couldn't recite it, but
So
it's it's one of my favorites.
I wrote it by hand and I have it kind of like against the wall on my desk. And it's just like top of mind all the time. And so those were some of the examples of like the things that have pop up that were like directly connected with me finding, like you were saying, right? Like finding the quiet time, the grounding time, the pause. Um, Currently I'm going through Devotions by Mary Oliver. And it's just like I don't go through them in a way that is kind of like reading. I feel like we were trained in grad school to skim and to go quickly
Yes.
through things.
Yes.
And like for this moment, I want to have my full presence to read through them and to enjoy them.
So I'm so happy you said that because first of all, it's very difficult for me as you're listing off all these books to not go like pick them off my shelf and show them to you that I'm so proud that we love the same things. Um, but you mentioned writing it out or reading it out loud. This was part of my practice when I would start to read poetry. I would not loudly because I had roommates and poor Nathan didn't want to listen to me loudly read poetry in the morning, but
Hi,
I would sort of
Nathan.
hi Nathan. I would sort of I would open the book and sit down with my coffee and all the sort of trappings of a lovely morning and sort of read or kind of like whisper basically it to myself as I'm reading it to make myself not treat it like one of our horrible readings from class, to not be, you know, highlighting the important parts that would be on an exam, right? Because there's no exam for this stuff. It's just like you said, applying it to our everyday lives and internalizing it so we can live it. And I like that helped me a ton, and it's something I still do in the mornings, which is, maybe I'm not going to get through as many poems and be the kind of completionist of like, oh, clocked another book, like that one
Mm-mm.
is done, and I can set it aside. Especially something like The Guest House, where like that's a poem, and this is true of so many of Rumi's poems, which is you can read that poem every single day and get something new out of it and find something new to apply it to. And it is a lesson that even the most Zen person in the world needs to relearn every single day if their goal is kind of mindfulness and equanimity and these things that we seem to strive for but have so much trouble doing. And so I think that's a really important, message for people who are really interested in poetry, is like finding something you like and that really resonates with you, and then being not just prepared, but excited about learning new things from it all the time and rereading it. It's why I think like one thing I really want to try to do is find some of the poems that I know really resonate with me, whether it's The Guest House or like Wild Geese by Mary Oliver, or these other ones that like a lot of people know, but that like I would like to be able to memorize and recite it, not as like a trick I can do at parties, but just for myself, that I can say it to myself in tough moments. That's something I really want to try to do. So I'm so glad you said that about
And
writing it down.
And I will say too, for anyone who's listening who might be feeling intimidated about poetry, I think there is, you have those of us who feel a lot of emotions. And it's just like we are who we are. Okay.
Yes.
Like that it is what it
Yeah.
is.
Yep. I
We
understand this
tried
about myself now.
we,
It's
we
yeah.
tried to reel it in when we were in grad school, giving ourselves the structures and,
Hmm.
rigidity and all those stuff. It didn't work. Like we are who
No.
we are.
Yep.
That said, not everybody might experience it the same way, right? And I think that that's part of, if you are interested in poetry, giving yourself the permission to sitting down with the text and reading it. And there might be times in which like something connects with you really deeply. I do remember the first time that I read Wild Geese in its entirety, I started crying. And that might happen, but it might not happen. Maybe you're not clicking with the poem, and maybe you read an entire book of poetry and you don't click with it. And that is completely fine too. Because I think that sometimes what happens, especially with something like poetry and literature, is that, like you were saying, everyone can find meaning depending on the context on the day. And like the meaning that you found today might not be the one that you find tomorrow. And yet, that doesn't mean that there is a need for gatekeeping or inadequacy when it comes to relating to it.
Yeah, and a poem that you read one day, you may, and this has been my experience going back through, my old notes and flags of these poems that I marked, upwards of 10 years ago, is I'll go back to them and maybe I won't remember having read it the first time, even though I clearly liked it. But then it'll hit me in a completely new way and it will find its way into some new crack or crevice of my life that has opened up since that time. And this, like, to me, this is the thing. This is the beauty of poetry. I mean, there are many beauties of poetry, but this is the one where it's like, it's the exact opposite of the skimming and the highlighting that we did in grad school for these articles, where like the instructor had in mind the thing that they wanted us to get from the text and to regurgitate in an exam, and there's a place and time for that stuff. Like, I've developed expertise about political science over these years, and it's because I did a lot of these readings and drilled a lot of stuff into my head. But what I like about poetry is that it has helped keep me open to new ideas, new ways of being and thinking about life, both in my work and outside of my work, because of its structure or lack of structure, because every poem looks really different, because all of them are coming from that particular poet's experience, and because there are infinite numbers of ways to enjoy them and to get something from them and to experience them. Like, the same Wild Geese might mean something very different to one person as it does to another person, and both of those are completely valid and beautiful. So that's one thing I really love about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, so much of our creativity is also an offer, and so like, and this is especially the case for something like poetry. Like, you offer it to the world, and then it's up to everybody else to kind of like embrace it and understand it in different ways. And so I think that for us as readers to give ourselves that permission to engage with it from that space of curiosity and rather than judgment.
Well, if poetry is an offer, I hope us talking about it has maybe encouraged some folks to take up that offer, or at least be open to it, because it's done a lot for me. I know it's done a lot for you. We've there are a billion other things we could talk about. There's all kinds of stuff I wanted to talk about that we didn't get to, so I guess we'll just have to do this again sometime. But for now, Analía Gómez Vidal, I really appreciate you joining me and reconnecting and thinking about all of the things.
Thank you so much, Charlie Hunt, for having me. And I really do look forward to continuing our conversation, because I know there is plenty that we can continue talking about.
I hope you all enjoy this conversation as much as I did. If you want to hear more from Annie or about Annie, or you're interested in her services, you can find her at agvservicesllc.com and at agvservicesllc on all of the social media channels. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.